So I am sitting with Ahmad Rahman, who is a professor of history at the University of Michigan-Dearborn, and who has had a very interesting and long experience in the civil rights struggle in and around Detroit, here in southeast Michigan. And so we will have a conversation about a couple of aspects of the history of civil rights here in this region. Ahmad, welcome.
Well, thank you.
It's my, I'd like to start by kind of going back to Martin Luther King. Of course, we're just a few days after the 40th anniversary of the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King. And I was thinking back to the comments that you made on the occasion of Martin Luther King Day a couple months ago here on the campus. And I was thinking that your thoughts about Dr. King are just so interesting that I was hoping maybe we could begin by talking a little bit about him.
Okay, well, my thoughts about Dr. King actually evolved. And I remember the first time I really began to take him seriously was after the bombing of the church in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. And I remember he had made some kind of statement about us not hating and not becoming that which the people who bombed the church were. And I remember thinking that his philosophy of nonviolence in that situation just didn't apply. And I didn't agree with him. And around this time, my mother's, one of her best friends had gone to the Nation of Islam temple in Chicago, which is where I was living then, and had seen this man named Malcolm X. And Malcolm X had said that black people should get their own army of soldiers to go down south and protect our women and children from being bombed by the Ku Klux Klan. And I remember when I heard that, I just thought that, we had a little assignment in school where we were supposed to be taking notes and stuff, and I wrote down in my little notes about this guy named Malcolm X, and I wrote ECKS for X. And I just remembered I thought that whenever this army of black men went down south to protect our children from being bombed in churches by the Ku Klux Klan, that I wanted to, whatever I had to do, just carry water or stir oatmeal or whatever, I just wanted to be there and do it. And so I identified, like many of my generation, the young people identified with Malcolm X. And my father and mother's generation identified with Dr. King. But as when Dr. King was assassinated in April of 1968, that made me begin to really pay attention to him. And later I began to read his speeches and see things that he had said that were not popularized. And I came to the point of view that many people assassinate Martin Luther King in 1963 on the steps of when he's giving of Lincoln Memorial, when he's giving his "I Have a Dream" speech. They end him right there, as if he had died right there. Mm-hmm. When he lived 5 years longer, and he had more than dreams; he had plans.
Well, that's a really important point. I guess a couple of parts of that I find interesting is the kind of tension that you're describing between the appeal that Malcolm X had, mm-hmm. and it would be great if you could talk about that a little bit more, mm-hmm. and then both the appeal that Martin Luther King had, but also from your point of view as a young person at that time, some of the ways in which that was appealing or was not appealing.
Well, Dr. King at that time, particularly in the North, and quite often when people deal with the history of the Civil Rights Movement, they don't see the difference between the North and the South. They don't understand that our situation in the North was different. We didn't have segregated buses, for example, and we didn't have segregated workplaces. We had a segregated, mostly white police department, and we had segregated schools in most cases. However, the segregation was not of the kind that it was in the North. And black people in the North were of a different mentality, it seemed, than black people in the South. And in the North, young black males, particularly myself and my generation, we saw on television Dr. King and the marchers being spat on and having dogs sicked on them and not fighting back. And that didn't appeal to us. We saw that as being weak, particularly because in our neighborhoods, we had to fight against white gangs. At the time, Chicago on the south side was divided by gangs. And I remember on the other side, literally on the other side of these railroad tracks, was a white gang called the Diablos. And on that side of the railroad tracks were stores and theaters that we couldn't go to because the white gang, the Diablos, would assault you if you went there. Nobody black could go on that side of the railroad tracks. And I remember one day my older brother coming with a group of men in the summertime. And they were all sweating and they were all excited, and they had chains and they had knives and they had bats. And they said, we went to the Capitol Theater today. And that was my first experience with integration. It wasn't of the integration of the kind that Dr. King was doing down south. And in many cases in the north, there were similar experiences where we actually had to fight. So our seeing Dr. King in the Southern movement not fighting back and being spat on, it felt like, well, if the Diablos spat on us, we're not going to fight back. We're going to sing "We Shall Overcome." It didn't fit with our point of view in the world. So when we hear Malcolm X begin to ask the question, and a very striking question, he said, why is it that we got violent in Korea, we got violent in World War II and fought against the Japanese and the Germans, we get violent in Vietnam against the people who never did anything to us, but when the Ku Klux Klan comes and blows up your churches, you get nonviolent? That was a glaring contradiction, and it made sense to us. Why were our brothers now going to Vietnam, coming back with one arm and coming back addicted to heroin and all that, but come back to America and they've done all this violence over there against the people who never did anything to us, but they come back to America and get very nonviolent? It just didn't make sense. And Dr. King resolved that contradiction later by saying that he would be wrong to be telling people to be nonviolent in America and yet be violent in Vietnam. And he turned against the Vietnam War in his famous speech, I think in 1966.
Mm-hmm. Is this one of the things you were mentioning? It's such a powerful phrase that you used, that some people assassinate Martin Luther King in 1963 and therefore miss all of the development and the other ideas and values that Martin Luther King had. His opposition to the war would be one part of that. Are there other parts that you're thinking of as well?
Yes, I think a lot of what Martin Luther King was in the 1950s people don't know. They don't know about his doctoral dissertation in which he voiced a critique of communism because of its lack of respect for the individual. But also he had a critique of capitalism when it did not respect the importance of the collective and of people's welfare. And he began to advocate, beginning in the late 40s and in the 50s, what he called a form of democratic socialism. People don't know that's what he did, and that he wrote in socialist journals, and that he went to Africa, and when Kwame Nkrumah led the first black African country to independence after World War II, at his inauguration was Martin Luther King. 3 months after the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, Martin Luther King is there in Africa with Kwame Nkrumah, and when he comes back, he begins to speak in the language of Kwame Nkrumah and Patrice Lumumba and the other leaders of the African liberation movement, and he begins to denounce what he says is imperialism and colonialism as the enemies of the people, not just in Africa, but in Asia and Africa and Latin America.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting.